how does immune aging lead to all the other forms of aging that we see in our biology?
The inflammatory reaction is a protective response that our bodies have to injury. And so as you accumulate damage and injuries in your body, your immune system responds and tries to fix things. The problem is that during aging, the damage accumulates to such an extent that the body cannot deal with it. And so you have a chronic state of inflammation. The problem, and you might think the system becomes essentially overwhelmed. And what's quite interesting is that the chronic inflammation versus acute inflammation becomes a problem by itself, and it contributes to the development of all of these diseases of aging.
Eric, it is an incredible honor to have you on this podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure to be here.
You are one of the foremost experts in the world, I would say, in the field of longevity. And I'm going to put that in quotes because I know we need to make some definitions of that term. I personally, when we were together in Cannes a few months ago, or a few weeks ago, I talked about the definition of longevity and how that's been really, I think that term is not what it used to be or what maybe you and I envisioned it to be. And so I'd love to start there, Dr. Verdin. What do you think people get wrong when they think about this term longevity or their own longevity?
Well, we are in some way becoming the victim of our own success. No one talked about longevity 20 years ago. There have been dramatic changes in the science of aging. And as scientists, I think when we saw these changes 25 years ago, we thought, oh my God, it's going to be a sort of revolution and we're going to change the course of humanity. And so it turns out that we were not the only one noticing this. And so the whole term of longevity today sort of encompasses a whole field. And I've taken a view which goes from the extreme, the people who will tell you that we're going to live forever, to a group of people who say, no, we should just focus on health span. And I take a pretty comprehensive view of the field. I think everyone has a right to express themselves. I think one of the good news of what's happening today is the fact that there's a lot of interest in health. And that's what I take as the positive thing. That being said, as the leader of an organization that focuses on the science of aging, I try to stay grounded by the principles that animate the whole science enterprise, which is, we are evidence-based. We provide treatment or interventions that are proven. And if we don't have a proof, we actually work at getting them. So I tend to occupy a bit of a more conservative space within the longevity realm, but there's room for everybody. And I think it is an open civilization, so everyone can express what they want. But I feel that I have to stand for what science stands for.
No, and that's why I love your voice in this conversation, because I think recently, maybe it was Peter Diamandis that was there at the Buck Institute, and you guys were having a conversation. And I think there's, and we see this with organizations. I think there's an organization called the Revolution Against Aging or something like that. And a lot of times they focus on their view of the science is that our exponential growth in scientific discovery around computer chips and around computing can be applied directly to the science of the biology. And why can't we see exponential growth in our biological discovery? And how does that not translate into adding many years to our life? Longevity escape velocity is something that we hear a lot thrown around as well by Aubrey de Grey and other individuals. And I just wonder, how do you answer that question? There's this kind of a black box of technological evolution that we haven't really applied, I think, in my view, effectively to longevity science yet. And where do you think that can potentially take us?
Well, the good news is that there has been a revolution in our understanding of aging. It happened in the mid-90s, the work of Cynthia Kenyon and Tom Johnson, Gary Rufkin, and Lenny Garante, many others really changed our way and our understanding of the aging process. That is, it is a process that is in part driven by genes, which means that we can modulate it. And so the promise of what was shown in animal models, of course, made everybody excited. We can double the lifespan of many species using single mutations or using drugs. That being said, when you enter the realm of humans, there is a whole, what I call a barrier to entry.
Yeah.
And this is why it's so difficult to develop drugs for humans, because if you're talking about a longevity drug or longevity intervention, one of the important consideration is safety. If you're going to give a drug to someone for the rest of their lives, you better be sure that you're not going to shorten their lives.
Right.
So doing, as you know, being a physician, I mean, doing research and clinical trials is hard. It's expensive.
Yeah.
We know the history of drug development is littered with problems, and the public actually expects it from us to deliver, to recommend interventions that are safe.
Right.
Not always, but most of the time, and it's a very different situation if you're trying to cure someone from a cancer that is going to kill them within the next couple of years, where the barrier to entry is much lower and people are willing to take more risk, than to take a 24-year-old who says, I want to live as long as possible, or even a 60-year-old who wants to live as long as possible, to recommend something that is going to be safe and leading to the expected effect. So that would be my philosophy, is that the field of aging has entered a new stage, one where we are taking the science that has been shown in animal models and trying to bring it to humans. And I urge patience and some degree of conservatism, because so my attitude has been essentially not to walk around and tell people I'm going to live to 150 years old, because honestly, I do not think I will, but to really underpromise and overdeliver. And as you alluded to at the beginning, the field has a bit of a mixed name, because it turns out that a significant number of very visible people are doing exactly the opposite. They are overpromising, and my prediction is that they will underdeliver.
Yes.
I will remind you, early in the year 2000, a number of people in the field were claiming that we were going to live to 800. And they're not doing this anymore, thank God. Now they've replaced this 150, which still sounds very exciting, but I don't think we're there yet. Last point is, it is, I think it's Niels Bohr who said it's very difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. And if you had told me 50 years ago that I would be walking around with a supercomputer in my pocket, that we would be having this call, that I would be accessible via video call anywhere in the world at any time, we were talking about this as sort of some kind of utopia. Now, all of this technology is there in large part due to science and physics and discovery. So it's very hard to predict what will happen in the future. The science has advanced enormously, but there are still really significant hurdles to conquer for us to really implement this increased longevity that everyone aspires to.
Right. Such valid points. And, you're there at the Buck Institute. And I want to talk a little bit more about the Buck Institute in a minute, but I would, you have your finger on the pulse of the science every day. Most of the science is being run through you. You're seeing a lot of the research that is coming out. What has surprised you in the last year that you've seen? Is anything really surprising that you've seen in the last year that has come out?
Surprise, yeah. I mean, and made me very, very enthusiastic, which in some way moderates my conservatism. Sometimes, I come across as being very conservative and a naysayer, but I'm not. I'm as excited as anybody by what we are discovering, by what the speed at which the field is moving. There's I would say not a month that goes by that I don't see a paper that excites me. So the science is amazing, and it will undoubtedly change the way we age in the future. That would be, that's pretty much where I am right now. So full of hope, in terms of the future. Now, if you think about one discovery that I find is probably the most important in the last 10 years, would be this idea of epigenetic reprogramming. And if you want, I can speak a little bit about this. It's this idea that, our biology is driven by two processes. First is our genome, the codes in our DNA. That is inherited from both of your parents. It is fixed for life. It doesn't change unless you accumulate some mutations, which can lead to cancer. So that is, and every cell in your body has the same genetic material. So how is it that one cell becomes a heart cells, another one a neuron in the brain? It is through a process that we call epigenetics. It's another layer of control, which is at the level of the histone proteins and the DNA modifications. And this is the whole idea of epigenetics. So this regulation actually determines whether a cell becomes a neuron or heart cells or muscle cells. And that regulation is actually a lot more plastic that we had anticipated. By plastic meaning we can modify it. And one of the ways in which we modify it is via lifestyle factors. So I think it's Mike Warson who says we are all genetic engineers. So when you go to exercise, at the end of your exercise, you are not the same person as you were before. A whole series of chemical reactions have taken place, and you are now different. And so that's one of the ways in which we can really influence our longevity. Right. One of the biggest discoveries is the idea that, two discoveries. One, we can measure these epigenetic changes, and this is the basis for what people refer to as these epigenetic clocks. So this is measuring the state of these modifications, which allow you to determine where you are in terms of your aging process, at least to some extent. And the other thing is we now have tools that allow us to modify the epigenome, this level of regulation. And it turns out if you reprogram your cells using transcription factors, this is maybe a little technical, you can actually reverse the aging process. It turns out that epigenetics regulates cell identity, but also with aging, it becomes somewhat loose. And so cells lose a little bit of their identity. Your red blood cells might look a little more like a neurons, and your muscle cells a little more like a heart cells. And so this contributes to some part of the aging process. And we have discovered ways in the laboratory animals to actually reprogram the epigenetic landscape to make it younger. And it turns out that is our first evidence you can actually revert the aging process. Now, I should say,
sorry. Go ahead.
So this is actually pretty amazing if you think about it. So at least it doesn't revert all of the changes of aging, but there's a very big part of it that we can revert in the laboratory setting. Now, the big question is, how do you do this in humans? And a number of companies have been launched. I mean, the most visible is Altos, which aims to reprogram organs and tissues. There's a big mountain to climb, and I think we probably will do this in individual organs or individual tissues first. But we all hope at some point you could actually reprogram the aging process in a whole individual. So that is one really exciting experiment. And we're working on this in our cases in the immune system, which is a highly relevant organ in terms of aging, and I hope we get a chance to discuss this, and one that is also highly accessible. So I have a hard time not to be optimistic and excited about what this holds for the future.
Yeah, it's incredible. And you're referring, I think, to the Yamanaka factors and the ability to apply these basically 4 proteins to any cell and reverse the aging process and make a differentiated cell go all the way back in steps to an undifferentiated cell.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes. So the Yamanaka, Shinya Yamanaka, who was one of my colleagues when I was still at the Gladstone and UCSF, made an amazing discovery. You can take any cell in your body and you can reprogram it using these 4 Yamanaka factors. And it will actually, and you can make it go all the way back to becoming an embryonic stem cell. And this goes to the point that you can actually take a muscle cell or a lymphoid cells from a mouse, and you can recreate a whole new mouse from it. So you've erased all of the aging and that new mouse lives a normal life. So you have managed to erase the whole aging process, which is pretty unbelievable if you think about it.
It gives me chills just thinking about it every time. It's just, four simple factors can achieve basically immortality that we found in a mouse, right? You can go all the way back to embryo and take this mouse and make a whole new mouse that lives a normal life. Is that correct?
That was the genius of Shinya's discovery. He started with 250 factors, and he was able to whittle it down to 4, which actually do the job. Not one thing we should say is that this is occurring with an extremely low efficiency. Very few of the cells that receive the factors eventually make it, and we don't fully understand what is the process. Now, where this comes into aging is obviously we don't want to turn ourselves back into a puddle of embryonic stem cells. That would not really be helpful. No. But what Carlos Ipsisu Belmonte at the Salk Institute discovered is if you do a partial reprogramming, that is, you add these factors, the Yamanaka factors, and you don't allow the process to go all the way back to the stem cells, but you stop after a while so that you have not really completely changed the identity of the tissue, and then you allow it to relax back into its normal state, the cells are rejuvenated. So that is pretty far off, pretty cool. My only regret there is that I'm not the one who did the experiment because exactly. it was really ground shifting. And frankly, it shows us that the aging process, at least part of it, and that is important to realize, is part of it can be reverted.
Right. I'm curious though, you look at the aging process that is in stem cells, and as stem cells divide and they go through their divisions, they accumulate damage, they accumulate DNA damage over time, and then that DNA damage gets passed on to the next division of stem cells. How does the Yamanaka factors come in and reverse the damage as well in a particular stem cell? Is there any thought around those mechanisms?
It's a good question. And that's one area that my lab is studying. What is the effect of the accumulation of these mutations? Right. Because eventually, if you accumulate enough of them, by the way, they are not corrected by the Yamanaka factor. Yamanaka factor does not modify the sequence of the DNA. What it means is that most of these mutations that do accumulate during aging, and we have some evidence they do accumulate in the immune system in every tissue, slowly over time, eventually, are going to be a very significant barrier if we envisage that we're going to live, 500 years. So the accumulation of these mutations is still very hotly debated what role they do play in the aging process. Clearly, in the case of cancer, they do play a role. In terms of aging, it's still not totally clear. But my prediction is that when they will accumulate beyond a certain threshold, they will start hitting. Imagine the genome as 3 billion base pairs. Right. Some of it is referred to as junk DNA, which in part reflects the fact that we don't understand what it's doing. A lot of these mutations are so-called silent mutations. That is, they do not affect a gene or a protein, and therefore do not have really significant consequences. Right. But for the long term, it will be a problem because these mutations are random. And so identifying every single one of them and correcting every single one of them is going to be an almost a Herculean task. And I cannot, at this point, no one really has any idea of how we're going to deal with this problem.
Right. But to your point, though, this could be extremely useful clinically in cases where we need organ regeneration. Like, for example, I have a friend who's now suffering, he had liver failure due to NASH and alcohol, and he got a liver transplant. And that was the only treatment left for him, was a liver transplant. However, I do see a world like where you were saying, like for organ-specific regeneration for him, instead of going through a massive surgery and needing all of this immune suppressive medication, a therapy involving Yamanaka factors that can take the remaining liver stem cells and create new liver tissue would be a game changer for the medical community.
Clearly, and there is an enormous amount of research that is being done exactly in this direction. Now that we can take, for example, you would not even need to take the liver. You could imagine someone has liver failure. You would isolate blood cells from that person. You would revert them into embryonic stem cells. And then from the embryonic stem cells, you would differentiate them in the lab in liver cells. And so we now know how to, starting from an embryonic stem cells, which we call pluripotent because they have the potential to become anything. There are many protocols that allow us to take these embryonic stem cells, especially in mouse, and to differentiate them into any specific cell type. So the idea of tissue regeneration is going to be key in the future. Because there are two aspects to aging. One, there's preventing the damage that occurs, and that is part of the aging process. And that's, quite often, what we focus on is lifestyle factors, which are extremely powerful. And second, once an organ has failed, and we all have some frailty point, which means that all of our organs don't age at the same rate. Some people have an aging heart, some people have an aging brain, some others it's the immune system. So the idea is that you would identify which of your tissue is your frailty point, which one is the most likely to fail, and then induce specific regeneration of that tissue. So this is where the field is going, but it's going to be quite a few years before we get there.
Yeah, it's just incredible, though, to think about what the future holds there, because it is possible in a lab already. And so it's just mind-blowing to think where it's going. You alluded a couple of times already to the immune system, and I would love to dive into this. You said a couple of things. Number one, aging kind of starts, the immune system is one of the fundamental reasons where we age, or some fundamental areas where we age, immunoaging, immunosenescence. And also you said it's the most accessible. And I assume you mean, through a simple blood draw, we can pull out obviously white blood cells and immune cells. And really, if you look at everything that lives in the blood, where you're going to get the most DNA is through your immune cells to go into a process like you're describing, where you can maybe turn this cell around and go into a pluripotential stem cell. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about the accessibility of the immune system and why you've targeted that in particular at the Buck Institute and through your research. And how does immune aging lead to all the other forms of aging that we see in our biology?
So I want to tell you two stories both recent. So I studied immunology for many years. So for me, this was my area of specialization. And so when I came to the Buck and I had to really think about what is my lab going to be focusing on, I was a bit tired of what I was doing before. So I thought, okay, let's just define a new program. I decided to focus on immune aging. And at the time, the thinking was, there is a process called immune aging, which is, or inflammaging,
yes,
which is this idea that as we age, our bodies become chronically inflamed. And this is thought to be not only a consequence of aging, but also eventually a cause. So the inflammatory reaction is a protective response that our bodies have to injury. And so as you accumulate damage and injuries in your body, your immune system responds and tries to fix things. And it does this quite well. Just imagine if you cut yourself or if you burn yourself, you will have a whole series of inflammatory responses. And we're all familiar with this. First, it will get red if you get burned. Then there will be a bubble, eventually a scar, a crust, and eventually this will fall off and there will be no trace of what happened. So this is inflammation at work. So it's an incredibly important process that helps us to heal and repair. And so we are imbued with all of these repair mechanisms, which is an incredible gift, which allows us to survive. The problem is that during aging, the damage accumulates to such an extent that the body cannot deal with it. And so you have a chronic state of inflammation. The problem, and you might think, well, this should help to solve the problem, but it doesn't, because the system becomes essentially overwhelmed. And what's quite interesting is that the chronic inflammation versus acute inflammation becomes a problem by itself, and it contributes to the development of all of these diseases of aging. So that's the first point. That's how I got started.
Yeah.
But since then, I would say two big stories have emerged that I think have comforted me in the idea that studying immune aging is important in the field. The first one was the realization in mouse tissues. Again, this is experiments conducted in mice. If you induce a lesion only in the immune system, and we can do this using genetic tricks. That is, we can, for example, replace the immune system with a new immune system that has a mutation so that only the immune system ages at an accelerated rate. Okay, so there's technology in mice that allows you to do this, the so-called Crelox type of technology.
Okay.
Two studies have reported if you do this, you induce an immune-specific lesion, you find out that the whole organism ages faster. And so that was really puzzling. And so it speaks to one unique property of the immune system is that it is a distributed organ. When we think immune system, you probably think about your tonsils or your spleen or your thymus or your lymph nodes. But it turns out every one of our tissues has immune cells. They constantly patrol every tissue to check for damage, to repair, and so on. And so what was remarkable in these studies where an immune-specific modification was made is that every tissue aged faster. And so that indicates that if you have an aging immune system, you're going to see organismal aging. And that means also that by fixing the immune system, hopefully you could solve the whole problem. So that was one of the reasons. The second reason was, the second big observation is a paper that was published by my colleague, Tony Wiscorey, at Stanford. And this led to the creation of a company, by the way, called Vero, on the board of which I sit, which I think has really exciting technology. So what Tony observed is simply by measuring the relative abundance of a series of proteins in the blood, he is able to predict and determine the rate of aging in individual organs. Okay, so if you're probably familiar, if you have a heart attack, the heart cells get damaged, they release a protein called tropomyosin, but you can measure in the blood, and it's actually a diagnosis that's a criteria for diagnosing a heart attack.
Right.
But he essentially did this for every tissue. He identified unique proteins to the brain, to the immune system, to every organ, and by measuring them on the blood, he can assess the state of health of individual organs. Now, they just published a paper a couple of months ago in Nature Medicine, where they went back to the UK Biobank, this very large cohort of people in England that have been followed for years. I was able to get blood samples from, I think, 45,000 of them, and then to actually start asking very simple question. What do these organ-specific clock measure? Are they predictive of a long lifespan? Which organ is the most important in terms of maintaining health? And they identified two organs that were the most predictive of your life expectancy. And these were the brain and the immune system. And I would say not surprisingly, again, because these two organs, the brain and the immune systems, are both distributed. When you have a lesion in your brain, because the brain is essentially regulating, think about it as the supercomputer of the body, regulates the activity of every cell. So some brain lesions will disturb how your liver works. And so really identifying these two organs is the most important that you should focusing on maintaining your health, I think is another landmark study.
Yeah, it's so interesting because, when I think back on medical school and I think what was the most complicated subjects I had, it was always immunology and neurology. The level of complexity of the brain, anatomically, physiologically, and the immune system is mind-blowing. Like relatively, the liver, the heart, the kidneys are like child's play.
and I'll tell you another example. You probably went to medical school a little bit after me. And when I was in medical school, there were lymphoid cells, there were neutrophils, eosinophils, and maybe half a dozen cell types that you could actually measure in the blood. With the technology that we have today in my lab, we can enumerate more than 600 different cell types in the blood, which just gives you an idea of the complexity. So the more sophisticated our tools are becoming, the more we realize what we don't know and what we have to learn. But out of every one of these discoveries comes, new opportunities to intervene, to understand, and to really refine our understanding of the aging process.
And that just blows my mind that, we're taught in immunology classes in medical school and even as physicians that there's basically like 10 to 12 different cell types in the immune system. And you're saying there's 600 actual different cell types.
Just in the blood. It doesn't speak to all of the T cell macrophage subsets that are lurking in every one of our organs. And,
Right.
We know the immune cells in your gut are different from the ones in your brain, different from the ones in every other tissue. So, yes, we are, we live through extraordinary times where we have the technology to really probe deeper and deeper. And I make the analogy to the new telescopes. We used to think there were so many billion galaxies, and every time we get a new telescope, we realize, there's another, billions of billions more of galaxies. So, and the same thing for biology. The more precise, the more deeply we look, the more we realize the incredible complexity. Our human organism is 14 trillion cells. And therein lies some of what we see with the tech people. And I'm not saying this to pass judgment on them, but there's a little bit of a misunderstanding in terms of moving from the tech world where you control everything, you understand everything. After all, you have written the algorithm, you can go look at the code. Moving into a system like the human body with 14 trillion independent entities, each of these cells has more than 1 billion chemical reaction every second. So you just get into a world of such complexity that I ask for some degree of understanding and forgiveness for the slowness by which we discovering cures, but it is incredibly complex. And we are far from the full understanding of what biology is, what an organ is, how they interact, and all of this. Making rapid progress, certainly, and all of this accelerated by AI, but still, I think we should be realistic when we look at the complexity of what we're dealing with, that there are no magic answers. There are no magic bullets. The only thing that's going to happen is a continued investigation, understanding, and all this driven by science,
Right.
and by, accepting your defeat, revising your models. This is what science is all about. It's full of uncertainty. And this is the essence of what doing science is. You always try to find a better way to describe what you're observing.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful analogy there, Eric, where you say, every time we have a telescope, we discover billions more galaxies. And never do we say that we are going to enumerate every planet and star in the universe. We never say that, no matter how much technology we have, that we don't say we're going to go out there and catalog every one of these celestial bodies. Why do we think we're going to figure out biology way before we're going to figure out the universe, right? You think about Star Trek and how that's a never-ending journey for those people. The biology can also be a never-ending journey. It's that
I'm convinced.
complex.
Our model is for everyone, is to be able to write a code that would simulate the body. And this is actually, for the first time, these what we call digital twins.
Right.
And we have a big program here at the BUC doing this, which is the idea to actually modelize a living cell. This work is being done right now by some of my colleagues here at the BUC using bacteria, which are the very, very, very simple organisms. And even there, it is extremely hard to do. Now, thinking about doing this for humans, we are also taking these steps, building these models, and in some cases, they can be highly predictive. And that is a really exciting new area. So we are entering an area where we can modelize the human body, but I should say, with some degree of humility, we are just taking really baby steps, but they will be the future. One of the, as a physician, you probably are, acutely aware of the difficulties of conducting clinical trials,
Right.
or making recommendations for people in terms of their health.
Right.
We call this the N of one analysis, this idea that we are all highly individual and different. We respond to drugs in different ways. And the reason why clinical trials are so expensive is because we're dealing with an incredible diversity of genetic materials, lifestyle, and so on. So the way we do clinical trials is to take 50,000 people, we give them the drug, we separate them in two groups, 25,000 have the drug, 25,000 don't have the drug, and then we compare. And if we find any kind of signature of difference, even if 500 people show an improved response in the group with the drug is approved. What about the 44,500 people who did not respond? What happened to them? We have no idea. And so this is the impetus behind this trying to modelize biology, is to be able to much better predict what happens without going through an expensive clinical trials or putting people at risk who don't need to be put at risk. So that, even though I started by saying the task in front of us is enormous, it doesn't mean that we should not be trying. And, the Buck is really leading the way in trying to devise what we call precision medicine. Right. This idea that whatever is good for you is not necessarily good for me, and it can actually harm me.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, right now, Eric, I'm writing a book called N of One, just for my patients that need a clinical model to utilize this thought process. It's so important because, like you said, everyone fits somewhere in the bell-shaped curve. The problem is we don't know where you fit on that bell-shaped curve. And until we can model biology in a computer, which, as you alluded to, is going to take us a very long time, I think is important for humans and people trying to get their health right to use these N of one experiments on themselves, have some data to track and follow and see what's working and not working. And you just keep self-experimenting until you find a combination of lifestyle factors and other interventions that work for you.
Yeah, two great points. And then one that I can amplify in two different ways. One is Brian Johnson, who is being condemned by some people in our field as being sort of a attention seeker, whatever. I disagree with this. I think what Brian has done is incredibly important in a way that he has done, the highest level of self-experimentation that we can imagine. I mean, he tests himself very regularly, he changes interventions and so on. And he's been able to identify a whole series of factors, lifestyle, drugs, and interventions that do actually work for him. I do not doubt this. I mean, his numbers look pretty impressive. Right. That being said, they work very well for Brian Johnson. The big question in the field is, will it work for me? And this is where his approach is falling short. So I think the value of what he's brought is to essentially show us the way in which we could do this on an individual basis. The shortfall is that, a whole bunch of people are buying these supplements without any guarantee that it actually is going to work for them. And my prediction is that it most likely will not. So that being said, for us as a field, it points to a way of practicing medicine, not on a population basis, which is the way medicine is pretty much functioning. We do, as I described earlier, we do these large clinical trials, but by really going to the individual and testing in each person different interventions. And I'm sure there are going to be some shared interventions that will work for most people, but there are also likely to be significant differences. And so the idea is, how can you identify these differences? How can you model them? And how can you actually identify what is the best protocol for you versus me or versus your patient. So
Yeah.
this is where the challenge lies in the future.
Exactly. It's a beautiful place to be though, because
Oh,
if we didn't have this, if we weren't enabled right now to really go deeper into this N of one model, using computation and also just the thought process, we'd still be stuck in kind of an archaic field of medicine where we're relying on large scale randomized controlled trials that take forever to do and are incredibly complicated and expensive to make any headway. And I think like you mentioned earlier, we are at an incredible moment in time where that model is changing.
could not be a better time to. People ask me, when are you going to retire? I think I'm at retirement age, and I tell them, I think when they take me away and they say, "Have you considered retiring?" If someone tells me this, I will take that very seriously. But could not be a better time and a more exciting time to be a physician, especially at the cutting edge of research. I think we are in the process of rewriting medicine. And it's always hard to see when you're in the middle of a revolution, but having been in this business for now more than, let me see, I hate to count, more than 40 years. I've never felt so much excitement and optimism about the future, about the form of medicine that we will have 20, 30, 40 years from now. It's going to be transformative.
I agree with you, Eric. And I'm at Next Health in our clinics that we're really trying to create a distribution model where people can go to a clinic in their local city and maybe have not just these thoughts about N of one medicine, but also when new technologies, new therapies come out, we can rapidly bring them to the people. And I think, just like you, I wake up every single day just excited and motivated to be a physician in this moment in time, and just being part of this, a small part of this change, of which you're also kind of leading there at the Buck Institute, and I'm excited to be working on this with you and alongside you. I would love to kind of end our short time that we had together.
We went way too fast.
I know it went way
I
too
thought we
fast.
were just getting started.
Right. I'm hoping you would please grace me with one more conversation in the next few months. I'd love to dive in on some topics. I have a whole list of topics I wanted to dive in with you. So hopefully we can have you back.
With great pleasure. Love talking to you.
I love it. I would love to just kind of end this podcast on some of these shared interventions that you really believe in, that you utilize yourself, that you think most people listening to this podcast could really move the needle with, modifying their epigenetics and just adding more health span to their lifespan at this point in time. You're an incredibly healthy individual yourself. You look incredible. And I would love for you to give us a few of the top, maybe 3 to 5 interventions you think would work for most people out there.
I'll make 2 points. The first one is, it's going to sound pretty harsh, but it's the reality. There are no supplements and no drugs in humans today that are known to safely increase health span or lifespan. Okay, so that the data is just not there. We're working on it. We're doing clinical trials with drugs. So this is all ongoing. Yeah. So if you choose to go on a supplement or on a drug, you're taking some degree of risk. And so it might work for you or it might not. We will not know for another 5 to 10 years. Many of the early candidates are being tested right now.
Right.
That being said, there are a number of things that I do and test, and because I consider it part of my job. So I do, I'm sort of a Brian Johnson in my own right. In a way, I do a lot of self-testing. I do experiment with different drugs, and I try to see what is the effect on my body. And I measure, and some of them, frankly, don't work, and some of them actually do seem to work. So I don't mean to be saying that you should not be taking anything, but you should do it with the support of a physician, someone who actually knows how to look at your biology. And I'm worried about what I call Instagram medicine, which is essentially, a supplement gets touted with great enthusiasm. Sometimes I'm dumbfounded by how our science actually gets translated into Instagram medicine, and sometimes with horror, because there's no basis or, the whole. So that's one aspect. The second aspect is we do know what increases health span and lifespan today. And the best we have is lifestyle factors. Now, someone is going to say, well, I know my grandmother told me, and then, I should be eating well, I should exercise, I should sleep, I should decrease stress, I should have human connections. These are all the factors that determine health span and some degree of lifespan. Today, based on what we know, most of us could expect to live to 95 in good health. Now, as you know, this is very different from the reality where most people in the US live in good health until age 65. Right. So there's 30 years of extra life that most people, unless you have an accident or you carry some kind of mutation that puts you at risk, most of us could live to 95 in good health. So that is, to me, that's already absolutely incredible. And I would urge your audience to really, inquire, what are these factors? How do I apply them? Because this extra 30 years that you're going to gain is going to give us the time to bring up the next generation. Right. So, people think, some people have argued that I'm talking too much about health span and lifestyle modification. I do it because I think this is proven to work. So we know if you do this, the response is going to follow. And that will give you an extra 30 years to benefit from what science is going to bring in the next 30 years. Right. That would be my advice for people, rather than jumping on the next Instagram sort of fad. Just really focus really hard on what is available today. What does the science say? Now, in this respect, there's also a lot that still is unknown. When we're talking about exercise, people quite often will ask, what form of exercise? Should I run? Should I jog? Should I row? Should I do high intensity interval training? In what proportion? Should I do balance? Should I do yoga? Right now, my philosophy is that I try to do a little bit of all of them, because we do not fully know which ones lead to the longer life. That is also being studied using the tools, the most modern tools that we have. This is a whole concept that Lee Hood and Nathan Price, who are two faculty at the Buck, have advanced in their book. It's called The Science of Wellness. And if you haven't read it, I encourage you to read it. It's a remarkable book saying that, wellness is not just fluff. Wellness is this idea that your lifestyle factors can dramatically influence your health and your life expectancy. The question is, how does that happen? Exercise is an incredibly powerful anti-aging intervention that we have available today, but we need to study it better. We need to understand what are the modalities. We're all busy. We don't know really how much we need to exercise. We don't know in what proportion between the different forms and so on. So these are all incredibly important questions. Same thing about your diet. The science of nutrition is somewhat confused right now. I have proliferation of all these diets, paleo diet and keto diet, Mediterranean diet. Which one is the best? The same thing for sleep, same thing for human connections. All of these are incredibly important. And I'm right now, I'm passionate about those for my own life, because I really have benefited and I see the results in terms of how I feel and my energy and so on. But imagine this distributed at the scale of the country, right? And the dramatic effect it could have on the population health globally. So I'm passionate about this, as passionate as I am about pushing the envelope and going deeper and deeper in our understanding of biology and inventing the next generation of medicine against aging.
Yeah, I love that. And I think we're all on the right path together with your sage advice. And we look forward to following you very closely with what you're doing in the Buck. I think you're definitely leading the charge here to maybe finding that intervention. But to your point, we can get another 30 years of health span, which is even, I would argue, even better than having a 30 years of lifespan where you're not healthy, because then you have to live, in a wheelchair. You have to live not recognizing your friends and family. So the focus should be in getting that 30 years of health span. And I appreciate everything you're putting out there, Eric. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, I'll make one last point, which is when I got this job, I felt, okay, this is a unique position in terms of being able to one of the leaders to be one of the leaders of the field, and people are going to listen to you, and I should be able to speak of personal experience. And of course, we all want to live long and healthy and happy with our families and our friends. So that's the universal goal. Everybody wants this. The issue is, how do you get there? And as I went through this journey of optimizing my health, the original impetus was, can I live long and keep doing this great job or having this fun job for as long as possible? But what I've come to realize as I'm doing it is that in the process, I feel better. I have more energy. Right. And so I don't even think about my own longevity, frankly. I think about the fact that right now, I think I'm optimized. I'm feeling the best that I have my whole entire life, which seems hard to believe. Some people don't believe me, but I think it is true. I have more energy, more focus, and so on. And this is a result of leading what I would call an optimized sort of lifestyle. And I think this is where, this is sort of the whole Buddhist principle of, here and now, and which is really where you reap the benefit from an immediate point of view. If I end up living longer, wonderful, but I also know that I feel the best that I could possibly be right now. And I think on this, hopefully this will encourage some of your listeners to actually engage in this journey.
Yeah, feel better now. Exactly. Eric, where can people find you and hear more from you?
Well, you can find us, at the Buck Institute. There's a pretty busy website with lots of opportunities to engage with us, to learn. We have classes. We have, if you're located in the San Francisco Bay Area, we have community seminars. I'm a lot on LinkedIn, which I think has emerged as a great platform for us scientists to actually convey some of our findings to the public. It's a little more elaborate than X, so you can actually expand on ideas. I find LinkedIn great. I also dabble on Instagram, but I'm still an amateur at this. I need a lot of help from my daughter.
I love it. I love it. Eric, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Can't wait to have you on again. We're going to dive in more topics, more specifics next time around with you. And I appreciate the work you do. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.